Hi everyone, my name is MTola. I am honored to be part of this conference. I would like to thank the organizers for setting up such a great platform for activating our collective imagination about the world in 2050. The title of my presentation is Making Cosmopolitical Commons in the Ruins of Europe. I am joining you from Rome, one of the European capitals, and it is from this particular location that I would like to address the topic of this conference. Europe has been the cradle of the colonial enterprise and industrial capitalism that played central roles in the making of the Anthropocene. The European liberal definition of property and the properly human still largely inform how we make sense of the world. They still largely regulate the entitlement to or deprivation of resources in our shared global context. So, what will this part of the world look like in 2050? In 2012, the European Commission published the Global Europe 2050 report. The document presented three possible pathways that Europe could follow in the decades to come. The bleakest scenario painted a picture of economic decline and fragmentation. It described the deepening of the economic downturn and predicted that the EU share of world GDP would fall by almost half by 2050. The report, however, was rather vague in describing the impact of climate change on the continent. Although the document acknowledges climate change as real, an unnerving passage notes that, quote, scientific conclusions about the causes and potential effects of global warming are contradictory. This causes the global policy response to be delayed and eventually fail. Yet, at the time when the report was published, there was overwhelming consensus among scientists about the escalation of climate change. Scientists haven't been debating the causes of the current ecological collapse. They have been debating how rapidly its effects will spread. Inadequate policy responses, therefore, are not caused by contradictory scientific debates. Rather, they are motivated by the mantra that there is no alternative to capitalist development. As Ashley Dawson points out, climate turbulence will first wash over post-colonial nations, places in the global south where decades of structural adjustments have weakened infrastructures and collective solidarities. Yet, he warns, the coming waves of climate chaos will wash across the entire globe. To be sure, the effects of the ecological crisis are increasingly palpable in Europe. Southern and Central Europe are seeing more frequent heat waves, forest fire and droughts. Northern Europe is getting significantly wetter, and winter floods are becoming common. Europe is already deeply divided, but unless something will radically change, it is likely that by 2050, new austerity measures, racist migration policies, and the acceleration of climate change will deepen the uneven distribution of precarity. Rather than just reflecting on the disasters produced by the intersection of ecological and economic precarity, I would also like to shift focus on collectives that strive to persist in the ruins of European modernity. Specifically, I want to direct attention to the commons as more just mode for living together on a rapidly changing earth. The commons has roots in medieval theological and legal debates concerning property ownership. The term traditionally referred to pastures, rivers, and wastes that were managed in common by peasant villages. The enclosures of land that occur in distinct but connected ways in Europe and the colonies between the 16th and the 18th century created a propitious ground for the rise of liberalism as a normative framework regulating property and exclusionary definition of the human. More specifically, I argue, the decline of the commons was connected to the affirmation of the European white man as proper figure of the human, entitled to appropriate the labor of women and slaves, indigenous land, and the material world as resources. Processes of enclosures are ongoing and continuous. Yet, I suggest that the commons has never ceased to function as counterpoint to liberal modernity and its legacy in the present time. In recent years, the commons has been taken up by political theory and a variety of social movements as a project capable of creating alternatives to regimes of property and profit that emerged out of European liberalism. Examples of social movements that have been invoking the commons include campaigns opposing the privatization of water in Bolivia and Italy, students contesting the restructuring of the university in the UK, and the protest encampments of Occupy Wall Street. These struggles for the commons often cut across issues of economy and ecology. They articulate resistance to neoliberal governance, processes of financialization, and extractive economies that intensify the wresting of raw materials from the earth on an untenable pace and scale. Within political theory, many tend to frame the commons through the distinction between self-organizing human collectives and a malleable nature. So, for example, scholars including Elinor Ostrom and more radical thinkers such as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri distinguish between the natural commons associated to the earth and its ecosystems and the social commons, which includes affects, ideas, information, code, and images produced by human labor and cooperation. Unlike the natural commons, the social commons is described as limitless and reproducible, governed by a logic of abundance and proliferation. I worry that such images of the commons reflect the modernist binary between active culture and passive nature. In other words, what underwrites them is still the notion of man as primary agent making the world. Here I want to propose a different image of the commons. Inspired by philosopher Isabel Stengers, I offer the cosmopolitical commons as conceptual resource for creating more just worlds in 2050. Stengers uses the prefix cosmos to make explicit the presence of beings that do not have a political voice and yet come to matter politically. As a way to illustrate what I mean by cosmopolitical commons, I want to share with you the story of a struggle that has been taking place in Rome. This story begins in the early 1990s. What happened is that at the time, builders working at the construction site of a shopping center in a densely populated area in Rome struck a source of mineral water that flowed through a geological layer storing ruins of the Roman Empire mixed with plastic debris, a marker of the Anthropocene. The water submerged the construction site and formed an urban lake bordering the ex Xenia, a former textile factory turned into a self-managed social center and laboratory for activists. During moonlit nights, the lake could be reached through a narrow path from the ex Xenia. At the end of the path, there was a drawn word, a skeleton of cement, submerged by glimmering water, taken over by vegetation, birds, and insects. Quietly, the lake began to exert its force of attraction on those who learned to care for its existence. Then, a few years ago, new development plans for the area were announced. An alliance of local residents and activists, including hip-hop artists and rebel scientists, organized a protest. They studied the geology of the area, tested the water for assessing toxicity levels, learned about the birds and plants populating the urban lake, negotiating with the local administration with mixed results. They turned the lake into a commons, but I suggest this is a commons where it is hard to tell when nature ends and the social begins. This is how the hip-hop song Il lago che resiste, the lake that struggles, composed as part of the mobilization, describes what happened. This is my translation of the Italian lyrics. The lake invaded the reinforced concrete and asked for help. We learn to imagine, love, and experience it. For some, this may conjure up the romantic image of an innocent nature that turns against plunderers to form a commons that activists are called to defend. More than untouched wilderness that needs to be protected, however, the lake resembles what some would define as second nature, produced by human action. But this second nature, I would argue, does something, is capable of altering the beings that press upon it. What I find compelling about this story is that the rebel lake became an active force in a project of commoning. The lake is not just an object, a resource, around which human subjects come together. Rather, it is part of a political collective as a being capable of enabling political thought and action. I want to suggest that commoning here begins with an attachment that brings together the activists, the lake, the animals and plants that populate it. An attachment, as Isabel Stengers put it, is, quote, what has the power to make practitioners think, feel, and hesitate, end quote. Attachments generate problems, pose questions, propel actions that could not be enacted by humans alone. This is not to say that the rebel lake is a political subject in the traditional sense of the term, but I suggest that what is at stake here is the redefinition of political agency. The power to make the commons does not pertain to subjects who manipulate resources deprived of political relevance, but to collectives that are not exclusively human. So I contend that this particular struggle illustrates the breaking down of the distinction between natural commons and social commons. It helps us to shift focus from the commons as resources to the commons as mode of living together that requires the interplay of many kinds of beings. This is what I call cosmopolitical commons. This struggle gestures toward an unknowable yet perhaps accessible future. What would it take to connect this particular instance of commoning to other sides of struggle? What if, in 2050, parts of the world from which I am speaking to you today would be characterized by the proliferation of cosmopolitical commons? Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.